The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. Sara was still in her work clothes. She hadn't even taken her shoes off, just walked in from work, set her bag down on the floor by the door, and somehow ended up at the kitchen table without really deciding to sit there. The tea she'd made was cold. She didn't remember making it. The stack of papers she'd brought home from the office, quarterly reports, a presentation she was supposed to have drafted by Thursday, sat untouched beside the mug, still in their manila folder, still paper-clipped in the exact order she'd placed them at her desk 6 hours earlier. She had been staring at the wall, not thinking, not exactly. More like existing in that particular kind of exhaustion that comes after too many weeks of too many things. The kind where your mind refuses to settle anywhere, where every thought you reach for slides away before you can hold it. She'd been in this state for weeks now, getting through the days fine, holding everything together at work, texting back promptly and smiling when she was supposed to smile. And then coming home and sitting at the kitchen table with cold tea and staring at the wall. Because when you are holding everything together all day long, the wall is the only place where nothing is asked of you. Her phone lit up face down on the table. She watched it for 2 full rings before she turned it over. Her mother's name. She almost didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to talk to her mother. She did, she always did, in the complicated way that you want things that also hurt. But because something in her body knew, before she touched the screen, that this call was going to change the shape of her life. She had been waiting for this call for 14 months. And there is a particular human instinct, when the thing you have been dreading finally arrives, to pretend for 2 more seconds that it hasn't. She answered. "Sara?" Her mother's voice, tight, controlled, not cold. Her mother was never cold, but the kind of controlled that takes enormous effort, the kind you can actually hear underneath the steadiness, like a river that looks calm from above and is moving very fast. "You need to come home, tonight." "Is it Dad?" A pause, too long. "Come home, sweetheart." She was already standing. She grabbed her keys off the hook by the door. She didn't change her clothes. She didn't finish the tea. She didn't look at the papers on the table. The drive was 3 hours. The highway at midnight was almost empty. Just long stretches of dark road, the occasional truck, the yellow glow of distant exits. She had the radio on, but she couldn't have told you what was playing. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, running through every conversation she'd had with her mother over the past few months, every careful sentence, every deliberate omission, trying to read backward into them for things she might have missed or chosen not to see. Her father had been sick for 14 months. She knew the number precisely because she knew the date. The 3rd Saturday of October, 14 months ago, when her parents had driven up to have lunch with her, and her father had seemed fine, had eaten everything on his plate, and argued amiably with the waiter about football, and then on the drive home had experienced something that her mother had initially described as a spell. It was not a spell. It was the beginning of a diagnosis that arrived in stages over the following 3 weeks, each stage quieter and heavier than the one before. The family, Sara, her mother, her younger brother Raheel, who lived abroad and operated from a permanent state of guilty distance, had reached an unspoken collective agreement almost immediately. They would be optimistic. They would use the language of optimism. They would not say the thing directly, the full thing, the true shape of it, because saying it directly would make it more real, and it was already real enough. So they said, "He's having a rough week." They said, "The treatment takes time." They said, "You know how strong he is. He's always been strong." Sara had become fluent in translation. She knew how to hear the doctors are adjusting his medication and understand what it meant. She knew how to hear he had a difficult night and know that difficult meant something specific and frightening. She had learned this language the way you learn any language you need to survive. Not from a book, not willingly, but from necessity and repetition, and the slow accumulation of context. She had been learning it for 14 months while living 3 hours away and working 50-hour weeks and trying to hold her own life together at the same time. She pulled into her parents' driveway at 2:43 in the morning. The lights were on in the kitchen and the living room. Her mother must have been watching for her because the front door opened before Sara had finished locking the car. Her mother stood in the doorway in her dressing gown, her hair pinned back, her face composed in a way that must have taken considerable effort. She looked, Sara thought, like someone who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and was starting to feel it in her arms. They hugged without saying anything. Her mother smelled like the jasmine soap she'd used Sara's entire life, and the familiarity of it, in the middle of a night like this, in the middle of everything, was almost unbearable. There was a woman sitting at the dining room table, mid-40s, professional but not clinical, dressed in the careful, neutral colors of someone whose job involves delivering difficult information, and who has learned that appearing approachable is part of that job. She introduced herself as a hospital case manager. She had driven out at this hour because Sara's mother had asked her to, because she had been that kind of thorough throughout this process. She had a folder on the table in front of her, blue, unremarkable. She placed it down gently, in the way that people handle things when they are aware of what they contain. "Your father's condition has progressed," she said. She said it simply, without softening it into nothing. Sara appreciated that. More quickly than the medical team had projected. He's going to require full-time professional care, and he's going to require it soon, within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Sara looked at her mother. Her mother was looking at her hands, which were folded on the table in front of her, very still, the way they got when she was holding herself together through the application of pure will and didn't want it to show. "The facility your family toured in September," the case manager continued, "they have an opening. It came available this week. These openings don't stay available. There's a waiting list of significant length. If your family wants this placement, the confirmation and the first payment need to happen by the end of this month." Then she said the number. Sara had known a number was coming. She had looked up numbers online, at 1 a.m. on various sleepless nights, because she was the kind of person who prepared for things by researching them even when she didn't want to know what she'd find. She had known roughly what the range would be. Knowing and hearing are different things. The number landed in her chest like something physical, like a door she hadn't known existed swinging shut. She asked a few questions. Practical ones, about the payment structure, about what the monthly costs would look like, about what the facility provided and what the family would need to supplement. She asked them in her professional voice, the one she used in meetings, the one that was competent and calm, because that was the only voice available to her in that moment. Her mother answered some of the questions. The case manager answered others. They talked for 40 minutes. Sara took notes on a legal pad she found in the kitchen drawer. Her handwriting was very neat. She noticed this and found it strange, that her handwriting should be so neat when her interior landscape was this chaotic. At some point, her mother made tea. Sara drank hers this time. The case manager left at 4 a.m. Sara sat with her mother for another hour. They didn't talk about the folder, or the number, or the decision that needed to be made. They talked about small things. A neighbor's new dog, something Raheel had said on the phone, the fact that the jasmine plant on the back porch had finally bloomed after 3 years of stubbornness. Her mother said it like it meant something. Maybe it did. Sara drove home as the sky was starting to lighten. She sat in her parked car outside her apartment building and looked at her steering wheel. She had been awake for 22 hours. She was not tired. She went inside and sat on her kitchen floor and stared at the ceiling until it was time to get ready for work. She didn't tell anyone at the office. Not yet. She had always been careful about what she brought into professional spaces, which parts of her private life she allowed to enter those rooms. It was a habit developed early and maintained deliberately. Her colleagues knew she had a father, knew vaguely that he'd been unwell. They didn't know the shape of it. She wasn't ready to give it to them. So she worked. She finished the presentation she'd been avoiding. She sat in meetings and contributed and took notes and nodded at the right moments. She ate lunch at her desk because she didn't trust herself to maintain the composure in the break room, where conversations were casual and uncontrolled, and someone might ask, "Are you okay?" in the offhand way people do, and she might actually answer honestly. She was not okay. She was also functioning. These things are not mutually exclusive. Most people who are not okay are also functioning. That is one of the great and terrible things about human beings. She called Daniel that evening. Daniel. She had met him 2 years ago at a friend's birthday dinner, one of those parties where everyone is seated too close together and forced into conversation, and most of the conversations are forgettable, and occasionally one isn't. Theirs hadn't been. He had opinions about things she found interesting. He laughed at things she actually found funny, not just the things people laughed at to be polite. He had walked her to her car at the end of the night, and they had stood talking for 40 minutes in a parking lot in the cold. And she had driven home thinking that she hadn't done that. Stood in a cold parking lot, talking to someone she'd just met because she didn't want the conversation to end, since she was 22. 2 years later, he was the person she called when things were real. "Hey," he said. He always answered like he'd been waiting for her call, even when she knew he hadn't been. "How are you?" "Not great," she said. "Tell me." She told him. All of it. The drive, the case manager, the folder, the number, the question that had been sitting in her chest since 4 a.m. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on without quite realizing it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you need right now?" he said. "Do you need to think out loud, or do you need me to say something?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I just needed to say it to someone real." "Okay," he said. "I'm here." They stayed on the phone for 2 hours. He was careful. She noticed how careful he was, how gently he asked questions, how he made sure his voice never carried the weight of what he was feeling onto her. She loved him for it. She also noted it, in the quiet, observant part of herself, because she had learned that the things people are very careful not to say are often as important as the things they do. The second choice arrived 3 days later, Friday afternoon. Her manager, a decent man, a fundamentally decent man, the kind who felt guilt whether he wanted to or not, and whose face showed it before his words did, asked her to come into his office. He closed the door. He kept his eyes on his desk. He told her the company had restructured. Her position was being eliminated. She had 30 days. There was a severance package. She thanked him. She walked to the bathroom. She stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. Really looked, the way you rarely do, for a long time. The face that looked back at her was the face of someone who has just understood that 2 things she had been counting on as solid ground are not solid at all, and have perhaps never been. She splashed cold water on her face. She went back to her desk. She worked for the rest of the afternoon. The pressure arrived from every direction, in every tone. Her mother never asked directly. Direct was not her mother's way, not out of cowardice, but out of a kind of dignity that refused to make demands even when the need was enormous. She asked indirectly, in the architecture of her sentences. In the way she described her days, "It's just very long, being here alone with him. Some days are very long." In the thoughts she started and didn't finish. "I've been trying to figure out how I'm supposed to manage the..." and then a pause, and then a subject change so smooth it might have been intentional. In the things she said she was grateful for, which always, always contained within them the outline of what she was missing. Sara heard all of it. She was her mother's daughter. She spoke the same language. Her aunt Nusrat called twice. Nusrat was her father's older sister, a woman of strong convictions and complete confidence in those convictions, who had been dispensing opinions since 1974 and showed no signs of slowing. She used the word duty as though it were simply a fact of nature, like gravity. She said sacrifice the way people say it when they mean it as a compliment, as if the willingness to give up your own life were the highest form of love, and anyone who hesitated to do so was simply revealing their character. Sara listened to both calls completely. She said, "I understand, Auntie, and I'll think about it, Auntie. And yes, I know in all the right places." She hung up the phone both times and sat with a feeling she couldn't quite name. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something between them. Something that had to do with being known incompletely for a very long time. Raheel called from abroad. Her brother, 4 years younger, who lived his guilt at a distance and expressed it through the frequency and length of his phone calls. He said all the right things, that he wished he could be there, that he was looking into flights, that whatever Sara decided he would support. He said it genuinely. She believed him. She also knew, with the clear-eyed knowledge of a sister who had watched her brother his whole life, that the support would be emotional and the logistics would land on her. Her friend Miriam took her to dinner. Miriam had known her for 15 years, had known her through a previous relationship that had ended badly, and 2 job changes, and the year Sara's grandmother died, and everything that came after. She was the kind of friend who didn't offer advice unless asked. She ordered wine and pasta and let Sara talk for 2 hours and then said, "Whatever you decide, I want you to make sure it's actually your decision." Just that. Sara thought about it for days afterward. Daniel continued to be careful. He came to visit that weekend, drove the 3 hours without being asked, showed up with food and no agenda. They didn't talk about the decision directly, or not at first. They cooked together. They watched something stupid on television. They went to bed early and lay in the dark, and she felt, for the first time in weeks, like she was inside her own body again, instead of somewhere above it, watching herself manage. Later, when the room was quiet, he said, "I want to be part of whatever comes next. I need you to know that." She said, "I know." She meant, "I'm scared of what that means." She went to see the facility on a Wednesday. She had put it off because going to see it made it real in a different way, made it a place that existed, a place with a specific smell and a specific quality of light, and specific people in it who were doing specific things. As long as she hadn't been there, she could maintain a certain comfortable distance from the reality of it. She drove there alone. She asked for a tour. The woman who showed her around was efficient and warm in equal measure. She had clearly done this many times and understood exactly what family members were looking for and exactly what they were afraid to ask. The corridors were wide. The rooms were decent, not large, not luxurious, but human. There were photographs on some of the doors. The staff moved purposefully. Nobody seemed rushed, which she knew to look for and was relieved to find. There was a garden with 2 stone paths and wooden benches, and a rose bed that was being tended by a patient who seemed to find this genuinely absorbing. There was a common room where 4 people were playing cards. A small library. A room with a television where a man she didn't know was watching cricket with the concentration of someone for whom cricket is still the most important thing. Her father would have liked the cricket room. He would have hated the garden. He was constitutionally opposed to gardens, to fresh air in general, to the outdoors as a concept. He believed firmly that everything worth doing could be done indoors. He would have sat in that garden bench, if required to, with the expression of a man enduring something unnecessary. She could see it exactly. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 10 minutes holding that image before she started the engine. She drove to her parents' house. Her father was having a good day. These came less frequently now and had a quality to them that was both joyful and aching, like sunlight through a window you know is going to close. He was dressed and sitting up and wanted to watch football, so they watched football. He complained about the referee in his classic, theatrical, deeply personal way, as though the referee had some specific vendetta against him. He got up twice to pace during tense moments, which was what he'd always done, and which she had complained about her whole childhood, and which she would have paid anything to watch him do for another 50 years. When she was leaving, he looked at her from the hallway and said very clearly, "You look tired, sweetheart. Go home and sleep." She drove home and did not sleep. The lists started that night. She had always been a list maker. It was her primary coping mechanism, the way she externalized internal chaos into something she could look at, reorder, cross out. She made lists of pros and cons. She made lists of costs. She made lists of what she would lose in each scenario, and what, if anything, she might find on the other side of that loss. She made lists of questions she hadn't asked yet. She made a list of everyone who had an opinion, and what their opinion was, and what their position in relation to her life was, because she found it clarifying to remember that an opinion and a stake are different things. The list-making helped, and also didn't help. Because what became clear over several nights of lists was that both choices had a shape to them, and both shapes contained within them something that felt like loss. Not just sacrifice, the kind you choose knowingly, but actual loss, the kind that takes something from you that you don't get back. Moving home meant the apartment, the city, the career momentum, the relationship as it currently existed, the version of herself she had built over 7 years in a place that had asked her to grow. Staying meant distance, guilt, the knowledge of being absent, the cost of the facility against savings that had once represented a future. She turned them over. She looked at them from different angles. She asked herself the questions she'd read about in articles. What will you regret more? What would you tell a friend? What does the future version of yourself look like? And found that none of the frameworks quite fit, because her situation didn't fit neatly into any framework. And the frameworks had all been written by people who weren't her, in circumstances that weren't hers. And then, at some point past 3 a.m. on a Thursday, sitting on her bedroom floor with lists all around her, she stopped. Not because she was tired, because she had reached the bottom of something. She understood 2 things. The first, the impossibility she was navigating was not what it appeared to be on the surface. It was not, at its root, this option versus that option. It was a question about who she was willing to become. Both choices, as they had been presented to her, as they had been constructed by the people around her, shaped by their needs and their love and their fear, required her to become a version of herself she hadn't chosen, to fold herself into a shape that fit someone else's answer. And the second thing, which arrived quietly and completely, like something that had always been true and was only now being said out loud. Neither option was honest. Moving home, giving up everything, taking on the care herself, was not automatically noble. It was not automatically love. It might be love. It was also possibly guilt, wearing love's clothing, which is one of the most seductive and most dangerous disguises guilt knows. A woman who dismantles her career, her relationship, her city, her forward motion, out of obligation dressed as devotion. That woman is not always better at love than a woman who makes harder, cleaner choices from a place of honesty. Sometimes she is simply a woman who has disappeared, who is running on depletion and unnamed resentment and the grim satisfaction of having made herself the sacrifice. That is not a gift. That is a performance. And it does not always serve the person it claims to serve. Staying, holding her ground, trusting the professionals, building her life, was not automatically selfish. She had grown up being trained to hear the word selfish applied to any choice that prioritized her own survival. She had internalized that training so completely that she couldn't even think the word without feeling it as a verdict. But she was 34 years old, and she was beginning to understand that selfish is a word applied asymmetrically and often weaponized, and that choosing to remain functional, financially stable, professionally alive, and emotionally whole was not a betrayal of her father. It was the precondition for being able to love him at all. Both options had been filtered through other people's grief. Neither had been designed for her. She made the third choice on a Friday morning. She woke up early, properly early, not the insomniac hovering she'd been doing for weeks, but awake, clear-eyed, with a sense of having arrived somewhere. She made real coffee. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd been staring at the wall for weeks, and she made a different kind of list. Not pros and cons, not loss and gain, just what is actually true and what is mine to decide. She called the facility at 9. She asked whether a structured payment plan was possible. It was not ideal, not comfortable, stretch across 18 months in a way that would require her to be disciplined and careful and to give up things she'd wanted, but possible. She confirmed the placement. Her father had his room. She sent her resume to 4 companies that afternoon. One of them was a firm she had been looking at for 2 years and had talked herself out of applying to every time, always with the same reasoning. I'm not ready yet. I need another year. I should have more experience first. She sent it this time without giving herself the space to talk herself out of it. She called her mother. She said the thing directly, not cruelly, not with a list of justifications, but plainly, with love and without apology. I am not moving home. The placement is confirmed. I will be there for you and for him, but I will not be doing it by coming back. I need you to hear that without it becoming something that breaks us, because I love you, and I don't want it to break us. Her mother was silent for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Okay." One word. It was the beginning of something, not easier, but truer. She called Daniel last. She didn't tell him about the decision in terms of what she had chosen. She just said, "I'm still here. I'm figuring it out. I'm not going anywhere." He said, "I know. I can hear it." She said, "What can you hear?" He said, "That you're back." She didn't answer because she was crying, and she didn't want to explain why, because the reason was too large and also too simple. She had spent weeks being pulled in every direction by every person who needed something from her, and this was the first moment in all of it when she had felt like herself. The year that followed was not easy. It was not a before and after story with a clear turning point and a neat resolution. Life does not work that way, and this story will not pretend that it does. The payment plan was tight. There were months when she transferred money with a tightness in her chest and didn't look at her account balance afterward because she knew exactly what she would see. One of the 4 companies called back, not the one she'd imagined, not the one she'd pinned anything onto, but a different one, a role she hadn't anticipated, something that turned out to fit the actual shape of who she was better than the imagined role ever could have. She accepted it. She drove the 3 hours more often than she'd expected, not because obligation demanded it, but because once obligation was removed from the equation, what was left was desire. She wanted to be there. She wanted to sit in that room with her father and watch football and hear him complain about the referee. She wanted to make her mother tea. Those visits, freed from guilt, looked like love. They felt like it too. Her father had good weeks and terrible ones. There was a stretch in February that she didn't talk about to many people. She drove up on a Tuesday night and stayed through the weekend, and when she came back she was quiet for a long time, and Daniel let her be quiet. And eventually she found her way back to words. Raheel visited twice. He was genuinely present when he was there. He carried what he could carry from where he was. She made peace with the geography of it, with the fact that families distribute their care according to their circumstances, and this is not always fair, and is also often the only way it works. Her mother came around. 8 months in, during a phone call that had started as a practical conversation about her father's medication schedule, her mother said, somewhat abruptly, in the tone of someone who has been thinking something for a long time and has finally decided to just say it. "I want you to know I understand why you made the choice you made, and I think you were right." Sara didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Her mother said, You're like him, you know, more than you think. He would have made the same choice. Sara thought about that for a long time afterward. Daniel was still there in the spring, more there, in some ways, than he had been, because the Sara who came through that year was less guarded and more present, less careful and more real. She had learned something about herself that she couldn't have learned any other way, and it had made her easier to be with, she thought, because she had stopped performing and started simply existing inside her own life. He noticed. He said one evening that she seemed different. She asked him different how. He said, like yourself, like you stopped waiting for permission. She thought that was probably the most accurate thing anyone had said about her in years. The choice she made is not offered here as a template. It belongs to her specific circumstances, her specific character, the specific shape of her love and her limits and her history. If you are reading this from inside your own impossible choice, your own folder on the table, your own number said aloud in a quiet room, her answer is not your answer. The details are never transferable. The situation is always yours alone. What is offered here is something else. The recognition that the choices presented to us in moments of crisis, laid out by the people who love us and need us and are frightened and reaching, are almost never the real choices. They are the choices that fear constructs. They are shaped by other people's grief and other people's conditioning and other people's unexamined beliefs about what love is supposed to look like, about what a good daughter or son or partner or person does when things fall apart. They are real choices. They have real consequences, but they are not necessarily your choices. They are not necessarily built around who you actually are. The real choice lives underneath. Finding it requires a particular kind of stillness, not suppression, not numbness, not the pretense of calm, but actual stillness. The kind where you stop listening to every voice except the one that is yours. It requires asking not what is the right thing to do, because that question is already contaminated, already shaped by other people's answers, but what is true. What do I actually need? Who do I become in each of these scenarios? What am I being asked to sacrifice that is, in fact, mine to keep? Sara found the third door. She found it alone, in the dark, on a bedroom floor covered in lists, at 3 a.m, when she stopped choosing between the two options she had been handed and started asking whether the options were the whole story. They weren't. They almost never are. The bravest thing she did was not choose A or B. It was refusing, quietly, completely, without drama, to accept that A and B were the only doors in the room, and then finding the third one herself, walking through it, alone, with no map, with no guarantee, with only the knowledge that it was hers. That was enough. That, in the end, was everything.